So hi everyone, this is the presentation by Soren about accessibility. Soren is an amazing person who is working currently at Benjamin Moore as leading the UX team and has a lot of work with a lot of different companies. I'm going to let them introduce themselves a bit more and share their own deck. So Soren, hi, thank you for being here and taking some time with us.
Hi there, everybody. It's so nice to be here and thank you for the warm welcome. I am really excited to give this presentation. And since we have such a small group, I think we can kind of run this a little bit more like a discussion. I was thinking that I would just kind of like talk at everybody and then we would have more of a question and answer at the end. But if y'all want to come off of mute at any time and kind of like ask a question or pop it in the chat, Max will then read it and let me know, because sometimes I have a little bit of trouble reading the chat at the same time as speaking. So if you don't feel comfortable talking on mic, you can just pop your question in the chat and Max will read it to me. So without further ado, let me share my screen. All right, everybody. I'm Soren. I actually am a person with a disability. I have a visual disability, which is why I sometimes have trouble with the chat as I'm on a Zoom call. I have been doing UX for too long, but I got into accessibility about 6 years ago. I started losing my vision and I started learning about how inaccessible a lot of apps and websites were. And I decided that I wanted to have a part in that. I started learning more about other kinds of disabilities besides just visual disabilities. And I started thinking about how I could be a part of that change by affecting products further up the pipeline before they got to even development or testing or got to market. And I'm really excited to talk with y'all tonight about how we can even produce products that are made for people with disabilities. So we've all had the what is accessibility talk, but I really wanted to pull out this definition so we're kind of all working from the same collective knowledge. Accessibility is simply the process of removing access barriers and providing the right support to fit people's access needs, including and especially people with disabilities. So a lot of people think of accessibility as this digital accessibility piece of, okay, well, it's got to have alt image text. We've got to have ARIA labels, and a lot of this stuff is very heavily developer focused. But if we zoom out a little bit, really, it's just about making sure everybody has fair access and is included in the development and production of when we're thinking about developing and producing products. And why is this important? Most people see accessibility, especially digital accessibility, as nice to have. And I accidentally left my bold text in there. I'm sorry about that. But most people see it as a nice to have. People with disabilities do not. It's an essential. And why is this important for us? When it comes to service design, accessibility is one of the most important and most overlooked items. A lot of times when I'm working with a team, accessibility is one of those things that gets slotted in by QA. They're like, okay, well, we did the design, we did the research, we went through and did the development, and now we're ready for accessibility and QA. But that is really not the way to do things. If you've been to any accessibility awareness talks, as I'm sure a lot of you have, it should be done every step of the way. You should be including people with disabilities on your teams, and you should be including people with disabilities in the ideation, the research, the design. And that's a little bit easier said than done. Just for perspective, 19% of the US population has a disability, and 34% of the working age US population has a disability. That's civilians with a hearing, vision, ambulatory, or cognitive disability. And working age we're classifying as 18 to 64 and under. So what that means is that we have a large group of people that is significantly underserved by the things that we're producing. This means that if people are not thought of with the products that we're producing, it means that we're often like retrofitting things. There's one of my favorite case studies is by from one of my favorite websites is called Digital Axis, like AXIS, and it's about how this group decided to start making 3D printed items to affix onto IKEA furniture. And so it was very much about like trying to make IKEA furniture work for people with disabilities, especially mobility disabilities. One of the things that I really liked about it was that it was very much empowering people to, you know, like find workarounds to make things work for them. But what I didn't like about it was that IKEA was like, hey, cool, this is awesome. Let's promote it. Let's make videos about it. Let's, you know, like let's promote this like it was our idea, like we thought of it. But then they didn't implement any of the learnings from it into any of the items. So they still produce these items. They've updated the colors. They've done all kinds of new runs of this item. And many of the items that were featured in this video that IKEA produced about these IKEA hackers, but they didn't make any changes or make any substantial moves towards making these products better for people with disabilities, which I feel like is a really big missed opportunity. This was one of the photos. It's one of the first things that come up when you Google accessibility. And a lot of people think of this as like the utopia, like, oh yes, this is what everyone can use. But I just want you all to drop in the chat if you notice what is wrong with this picture. I'm just gonna give you all just a second to take a look at it and see if you notice if there's any problems. Alexis, why is it not usable? Oh, no railings? That is one of the problems, yes. Visually too hard to see where the steps are, yep. I'll just say as a person with a visual disability, I have enough trouble with stairs. If you hide them with a ramp, I'm definitely gonna trip on that ramp. You have to give me a railing so I don't trip over those stairs. If you look at where the person is sitting, it's a little bit more clear if you kind of like trace the line across that there is a ramp that goes down, and the stairs they don't end at the ramp, so that you could very easily walk off the edge of the ramp and just somebody could twist their ankle, or it'd be very easy just to like kind of go right off the edge of that ramp. Yeah, Rosa, it's a little bit hard to see that ramp at first. When I saw this, I thought it was an art project because it looked very like architectural, and it was like, oh, well, this is really cool. But the more I looked at it, the more I was like, oh, I saw it first without a person sitting on it, and I was like, oh wait, these are stairs. This would be just a complete nightmare for me. This has appeared in anxiety dreams for me. But for a lot of people, this is what they go, oh, okay, yeah, this is great. It's a ramp. There's a ramp there, so people that are wheelchair users can get around. But yeah, there's not a lot of inclusion here because like there's not many different kinds of disabilities considered. It's also, as Thomas put, it's very non-standard. How do you use this? Like, how do you get around? There's not like really clear entry and exit points. And there's not like any kind of breaks to keep people from cutting you off or anything like that. So a kid that wants to just like climb up all the stairs could just go in and interrupt the flow of traffic. So it is a very non-standard kind of function, and could lead to a lot of confusion and a lot of actually problems for people that are wheelchair users trying to use it. Adam, I'm not sure I think this might be actually in Vancouver. This is Robin Square, I think. I believe this is in British Columbia.
It's Robson Square in Vancouver. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what it is. All right. And I ended up being able, when I was on full screen, to pull the chat up. So I can see all your nice comments now. So let's talk a little bit about accessibility and UI versus service design. So I touched on it a little bit, but a lot of people, they think of accessibility as the more like developer to like, once you get everything designed, and it's that missing component in between, like, okay, well, I've decided what's going to be in the design, and now I have to make that translation between the design and the developer. So we have to make sure everything's labeled correctly, and we have to make sure the form fields are right, and we have to make sure things have labels and names and unique states and contrast and all this. And so it's very UI heavy. It's also very code heavy to actually like make sure that it's quality controlled. And that's not really the inclusive idea of accessibility that I want to talk to this group tonight about. Y'all are service designers, and that gives you a really unique and really special opportunity to say, we're going to design something that not only does the UI support anyone using it, but the service actually supports people with disabilities. The product supports people with disabilities. The product removes barriers. A lot of people accidentally create things for people with disabilities. Instacart is one great example. It's gained a lot more, I would say, sorry, I lost my thought there. A lot more people know about it because of the pandemic and how many people have been ordering groceries online and having them delivered to their house. But before the pandemic, most of what Instacart was thought to be used for was like, oh, like you don't have time, or you're disabled, or you can't leave the house because you're a caretaker, or you're too elderly to get around, or you can't drive. So that was one of the things that Instacart was really created for, just not having time, or just maybe sometimes thinking about people that had disabilities, but it wasn't really created with that in mind. And it really shows, because one of the things that they do is they text you photos when something is out of stock, is they're just like, do you want anything that's in this photo? And I had so many times where I would have to put in the notes, like, don't send me photos because I can't see them. I can't read the text in them. So I can't really tell you what to get me from that photo. If you just send me like a blurry photo of the frozen food aisle, I can't tell you what to get me. You have to be more specific. And so things like that really tell me that, like, it wasn't at first created to cater to people with disabilities, but once they started getting feedback, they started building in this thing where it would they could send you a picture, but they could also send you a replacement item through the app. So you could approve or not approve that item. And it would tell you like a description of it if you're in the app using it while the person is shopping, which I think is really great service design of that feature to accommodate people with disabilities is to say, like, you don't have to be able to see the picture. You could approve this without ever having to know what this looks like, which is really great. And I did a little bit of training for their shoppers as well, so that when they're shopping, if you ask them to like tell you more about the product, or tell them like, oh well, like I can't really see well what's in the picture, could you tell me like if they have one that is vegan, that they have a little bit more training to be able to discern those things. So that's a little bit of like a very high level of the difference there. I just wanted to take a pause and see it, since we're trying to do a little bit more questions and answers through here, if anybody had any questions right here at this pivotal moment of the difference between UI and service design.
I guess like more than a question is a comment to that, because so I think that service design leverages a lot of different design disciplines, other design disciplines. So there might be like some UI, interaction design involved, graphic design, and to kind of build up all the touch points of a service. So it's actually like really complex, taking in account all of these different mediums and touch points and tools that for all of them to be accessible. So yeah, just wanted to put that out there. Not really a question, just more of a comment.
Yeah, you're very right. The idea of including people with disabilities in even, like signage, or, how people discover, just thinking about like the journey outside of the properties that you can have more control over, like the actual place where the service takes place, and thinking about, well, like how does somebody discover that service, and what's their journey outside of that service. It really does help to think about people with disabilities as people that exist outside of that moment, which I think is something that sometimes people struggle with, because they struggle to think of people with disabilities beyond, that really inspiring Olympian that they know, or that like one thing that they saw on TV, because it's oftentimes that they either see like the very like cherry picked stories, or they see no representation at all, which is a real shame. But I feel like there's a lot of people in between. There's some people that they have a visual disability and they don't feel like they can do design anymore. I've run into a couple of people that have lost their vision, and they don't even with assistive tech feel like they can do design. And then there's some people that are just like amazed because I still, with a huge monitor, and am able to do design and work in the field, and that's something that they just hadn't even conceived of, because they don't really see that representation of people with disabilities, which is why I think it's so important to do research, and it's so important to work with people in any capacity that you can, to fold in their experiences into how you're building that service.
Sorry, can I
sorry, Thomas,
hop in here quick? So
yeah,
actually,
absolutely.
I think the future of design, and actually the first time I said this, I was on a call with a bunch of designers, and they were like, whoa, because their question was, what needs to change with design? And after thinking about it for a while, we were bouncing around some ideas, and I think the best hope for the future of design is that it be less visible, that less visual. Like so many ways that humans interact with stuff, we're heading towards Star Trek. And the visual part of it is going to be like a side effect or an artifact that is nice to have. But it shouldn't be visual first design. I think that the future is we design for voice and we design for all of these other aspects. And then also it can look nice.
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. That one of my favorite things that I picked up from a talk somewhere is design becomes facilitation. And that's something that a lot of people I think discount a bit, is how valuable a good facilitator is, and also just how valuable it is to have somebody that is really good at the organizational aspects of design, and design becomes, facilitation, but then documentation, because if a design decision is made in the meeting and nobody documents it, did it really happen? So that's one thing that I feel like is really valuable, that design is branching further into like helping organizations do what they do better, like thinking about it, empathizing with customers, and kind of like shifting away from that like business first mindset, and then also doing like the research portion of that and getting a little bit more and more scientific. So we're getting like into that quantitative field, away from the make it look nice. And yeah, if it happens to look nice but it works great, that makes me happy. But I'm always going to be function over nice visuals, which is hard to sometimes to impress upon people that aren't as familiar with the design industry as a whole. But anyway, I'll keep going now. So one really important part that I wanted to bring up, because a lot of people go, well, that's really nice that you want me to test with people with disabilities. I really don't feel comfortable talking to people and asking them, do they have a disability? And I don't even think that I have a screener that has a space for that. And that's where I say, that's great, don't ask them. Really what you're asking is, does this work with the assistive tech that you need? Or, does this like support you in gaining access in a way that you didn't before? So just much as like we ask questions in a way where we have a hypothesis and we want to answer it, we would have to do the same with disabilities. We would have to say, okay, like, and my screener, I'd have to ask, are you a screen reader user? Or maybe even get specifics into, like, if you're testing an iOS app, do you use iOS and VoiceOver? And if the answer is no, then they can go into the non-VoiceOver users. And if the answer is yes, then they go into the VoiceOver users. And once you have like a statistically significant group, you can test with that group. I think it's really, really interesting how sometimes people in the design field are just like, well, I just don't feel comfortable asking. Sometimes you maybe shouldn't feel comfortable asking, because it's not as relevant like what their disability is, or if they consider themselves to have a disability, because a lot of people benefit from using assistive tech without being diagnosed with a disability, or necessarily even feeling like they do have a disability. There's also a lot of difference of opinions in the community at large, between like the neurodiverse communities and also the disability community. There are several different sub-communities within there that sometimes do feel like, on an individual level, that like being deaf is a disability or not, having autism is a disability or not, having ADHD is a disability or not. There's a lot of different opinions, and all of those are informed by one's own individual experience. So you might actually be missing out on good participants if you ask too much information, when what you really want to know is, can you help me identify if this will meet your needs? So if you want to, like test on someone that has like attention issues, you might want to just say, like, do you sometimes struggle with attention? Or do you feel like you need a tool to help you with attention? Or do you use time tracking tools to help you? Do you experience time in a linear way was one that I actually had asked of me on a survey. And I was like, wow, they really understand what I'm going through and see me. This feels like this survey was written for me. So I think the more you dial into what you're really trying to ask people, the more you'll understand like their disability, where they're coming from, or their access needs in general. And that's just like also a good rule of thumb when testing with people, is just to really meet them as an individual, because not all of them are going to want to be referred to as someone who's deaf or hard of hearing. There's some people that feel like hard of hearing is really offensive, and there's some people that feel like visually impaired is fine. I personally don't feel like it's fine. I feel like, I'm not impaired, I just have low vision. Like, does it affect my life? Yes. But like, I don't feel like visually impaired really describes me as a person or describes my experience. So I would say that while sometimes it feels like it's splitting hairs, like really approach people as individuals and find those commonalities of, well, I'm somebody that uses magnification. I'm someone that uses a screen reader. So I'm sorry, let's see. As someone that does understand or believe in time, that's awesome to hear about that question on the forum. Oh, thanks, Thomas. Yeah, I feel like there's been a select couple of surveys that I've taken that there's been a question on it that has really stood out to me, and I've gone, that designer really did an awesome job, and maybe should get a raise because that question was just impeccable. And this is one of those times where I just like remember it years later. So I talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to call out, because I feel like it's such an important thing. There are different types of assistive technology, and that's all kinds of different things that you may even have on your iPhone now, or your Android or your desktop, wherever you're joining from. There's all kinds of different options that you can turn on and their accessibility settings that just come free with any device that you have, because accessibility is really important. And so a lot of the makers of most operating systems already include it on their operating system, because it's very needed. It's a requirement. Now, do all apps and all software work with those OS level accessibility settings? That is not true. No, they do not. But basically anything that you use as a external device, or a setting that you can turn on your device that's not made to be an assistive tech device, is assistive tech. So here's a couple of technology examples. So we have visual screen reader, magnification software, both which I sometimes use, magnification more than others. Hearing assistive text would be like transcripts, closed captioning. There's a really cool new thing that I think Androids do, where it will actually, like, when you're taking a call, it will read you it in text, so you can actually like talk back and forth with a person without being able to hear what they're saying, which I think could also be really useful for other situations too. Like if you're in a really loud work site, or if you just like are on transportation, or there's so many other situations where I can imagine this being really useful for people that aren't permanently or temporarily hearing impaired, but maybe like situationally are hard of hearing, or like can't really can't really hear well at that very moment in time. Motor disability, so alternative input devices. Sometimes these are called switches. So these are things that you could use on your phone, like a head movement. Sometimes as one, you can have like a camera in it. Eye tracking control is another one. You may have heard of some of the voice control ones, like Speaking Dragon is one of the popular softwares that controls that. But that's a quadrant system. So you could say it's very much like chess. So when you think of people saying like, you know, my knight to you know, whatever square in a movie, when they're playing video chess, it's very much like that, but it's, you use it to do everything on a computer or on a phone, which is really cool. Diana just said true subtitles are also helpful for an international team with a lot of accents. And yes, that's very true. Subtitles are helpful when you have ADHD. They're helpful when you have two people that speak different languages watching a show or movie together. They're helpful just so you don't have to rewind sometime because, you know, for some reason you just can't understand what that person's saying. So yeah, there's a lot of areas which I feel like we take a lot of things from design for accessibility and we say like, oh, this will have to be really useful for something else, like curb cuts. And Siri came from design for accessibility. Basically, like any voice control thing that you have, like I can't say the name of it because it will activate, but you know, one of those Alexa type devices that you have in your home where you just like talk to it and it plays music for you. Any of those speakers, like those things, those all came from accessibility, which I think is so cool. Segways as well, personal mobility devices. That's where Segway's whole business model came from, is that they were personal mobility devices as an alternative to mobility scooters. And then they just have this whole business model of like selling e-scooters and all kinds of mobility devices to people that normally probably wouldn't use them, but they just like to use them for fun as like recreational vehicles, which is great. Like I want everybody to have access to them. The more people that have access to them and the more people that are buying them means it makes the cost more affordable for people with disabilities. And cognitive disabilities, there's like a lot of browser extensions for reading, color overlays. There's some really cool stuff with like Grammarly and things like that that help people that have cognitive disabilities with writing as well. And I mean, if you just don't have a cognitive disability, but you suck at spelling, like that's a great innovation right there. And in the chat, someone wrote such a great point about this type of inclusive design. Excuse me. Apologize about that. We were just saying, I was just reading from the chat that there was a inclusive design has wide-ranging applications, and the book Mismatch by Kat Holmes expands on this as well. Yes, and that was one of the books on my reading list, which I have at the end of this. So yes, if you ever are testing anything and you want to dive deeper into any one of these areas and you're just like, well, like how can I dive deeper into this? You can start looking up assistive tech that's made specifically to address any of these disabilities. And then you can look for users that use these specific kinds of tech. It takes a little bit more digging into and a little bit more research. But I feel like that kind of time spent on learning something about people that will be using the kind of tech that you're creating is never really wasted. because you'll be able to understand what people are talking about also when they talk to you about how they're using your product. So if somebody were to come to you and say like, oh, well, I'm using Speaking Dragon, and you have no idea what that is, I think that it can only benefit you to learn more about how people with disabilities use your software and would be able to access it. So I want to talk a little bit about maturity models, because that was like the entire driving force behind the talk. I kind of bulked it into one list of like, this is the most basic maturity models I can see, which is one, awareness. That's your 101 talks, your, oh my gosh, accessibility exists. Now what? Two is UI changes. So you start making the product accessible. Maybe you get Deque to audit your website and give you a bunch of things to change, and you do it and everybody's happy. And then three is what we're talking about right now, service design. You start creating features for people with disabilities. I can't talk about this specific project by name, but I did this project last year, which was so much fun, where we actually, that's all we did, was we just researched how people with disabilities, specifically visual disabilities, use rideshare services. And that was absolutely the best thing I worked on, because then all we did was we just talked about features. We talked about how they're using features. We tested some features with them. Some new things that are nowhere on the market right now. And it was just the best time I've ever had, because it was like, it was the opportunity to do something completely new. And it was the opportunity to step into the shoes of people that have other intersections that I didn't even know about or could even speak to. Like, I have a visual disability, but this person has a visual disability and a mobility disability and uses the service animal. So I can't really design for that experience because I don't have that experience. And I bring all of my ideas of like what it's like to have a visual disability into the design process with me, just as we all do. We're all bringing every single lived experience that we have into the design process with us, as much as we try not to. But that was like such a neat opportunity for me to have like a check and balance against myself, and to say, well, yeah, like I had to sit there and think about like, what would it be like for someone that had a service animal to get into a rideshare? And then they actually, did it. And we had to like, think about where would they put their feet, and then they have like an animal with them, and the animal can't go on the seat. And it's just a really interesting exercise in empathy, and also in saying like, wow, I really am just facilitating this conversation. Like it's an exercise daily and saying, I don't know anything, and I'm happy not knowing anything, and just like letting this information come to me, and then just like boxing it up really nicely and documenting it and giving it to the next person that will like work on it. It's really, really interesting to really experience that. So after that service design, and after that step happens where you're designing all these features to support people with disabilities, I think the organizational change is the next big step, where everything is designed with accessibility in mind. The organization is very accessible, like hiring is accessible. There's people with disabilities working there. The organization is really, really keyed into accessibility. And, it's not just DE&I, it's DEIA, or some people like to say IDEA, but that gets confusing with schools, especially. In any case, the utopia that we're looking for is that everything is designed accessibly, features are designed accessibly, organizations are designed accessibly. like the system design level is also accessible. The tools that you use are accessible, which I think is, you know, really a tall order, and it's a long shot, but that's what I try to push for as well, is to say, like, we're not going to use that tool if it's not accessible. I have the freedom to do that on my team, but you may not have the freedom to do that on yours. But it's always a good thing to push for, is to say, like, what's the next step? And for me, that's the organizational change. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the soft stuff. What makes for good service design when dealing with people with disabilities? So the top accessibility skills for service designers, I would say, are listening, research, and interpretation. This one is a big one. I feel like the listening one is a little bit hard sometimes, because we often are given like really short deadlines. There's a lot of different expectations put on us by like business and different competing ideas from different teams. We're often working with bigger teams, so we don't really have as much say in like what the overall goals of the project are. And we're not always designing for ourselves. So that's really hard sometimes. I know, like, cross-culturally, especially, it's been a big learning experience having to moving to a company that distributes internationally, because one of the things I found out was we launched a campaign before my time, which was apparently very offensive in French. And if we had just had somebody that spoke French on the team, then we would have known that the campaign that we launched was like offensive, but apparently we didn't know that until it had already launched, and people were pretty horrified. So we're not always designing for ourselves, and it's sometimes it gets to that point before you realize that you've made a really big mistake, and it's always better to catch those things early. If you're going to make a mistake, it's less expensive and less embarrassing to catch it early. So that leads us to the next one. Get used to hearing feedback outside your experience. It can sometimes be really uncomfortable. And like we showed those stairs earlier, sometimes it can also lead to some conflicting needs. Like somebody needs a ramp, but someone else has a visual disability. And so how do you make those two things go together? Sometimes it's as simple as adding handrails, adding contrast colors, making it designed so that it's ideal for everyone. But sometimes there's not really a great answer, and that's really an uncomfortable place to be in. And that's the last bullet, is that sometimes we need to understand and design for different needs. And sometimes those needs can not just be like different abilities or different disabilities, but they can even be, like cross different like intersections. And that's also like a really hard thing to sometimes deal with, is when you're outside of your comfort zone in several intersections. So listening was such a key skill to have, and then use like having that empathy to apply that listening with. Researching. I think a lot of people discount research as a really great tool for people that are more in like a siloed design organization to have, but even just being able to look things up and make a decision of interpreting what that means. Accessibility is a really dense topic. When we talk about like UI, especially, and talk about like that dev heavy end of things, service designers, I do not expect to like go out and learn all of the WCAG guidelines. I don't know all of them. I will Google every single thing or go to the WCAG website. It's broken down into topics, which makes it a lot easier and makes it a lot more digestible. And there's a couple of different websites that are like translating the WCAG into more understandable insights as well. One of the things that I've always found difficult was it's not always the most understandable thing in the world. So I really appreciate it when people are trying to like break it down into something that's a little bit more actionable or like has examples of work that they've done, which is so helpful, and especially when you're newer to accessibility. So having those like UI examples of different things is really, really helpful. When we're talking about feature level kind of stuff, I think there's even less out there right now. So research is it's going to be like a hard skill, but I think it's definitely worth putting the time in. But if you do have questions about WCAG, there's tons of resources out there, and there's a huge Twitter community of people that use the hashtag A11Y, so that's A11Y. And there's some other resources at the end of the presentation that I'll share out. And then interpreting, being able to take that guidance and research from people with disabilities and apply it to the design. That is a really, really useful skill. And it's there's not like a one size fits all, like if you do A, then B will happen kind of thing. It's one of those softer skills that I feel like is harder to explain about design. How that is, it's like a way of thinking that I feel like design does really well. It's not mutually exclusive to design, but I feel like designers generally do this really well. And so I feel like it's not a hard thing for us to think about as designers to start applying these insights. And so the last thing I would say is that understanding about the best skills is that understanding the models, like why accessibility matters to stakeholders, is super important, because then you can choose how to talk about accessibility to these stakeholders. So the first model of like accessibility mattering to people is improving lives and access. So of course, everybody loves to do the right thing. Number two would be to reach more people or customers. So you've got those statistics. Everybody loves a good quantifiable statistic of, 18% of people in the US having a disability, or 34% of people in the US and working age group having a disability. Like, those are your prime spending audiences. So you want to reach more people and customers. That's always a great argument to make to a business stakeholder. Number three, as my least favorite, avoid lawsuits. And that's the compliance argument, which is because the ACA or the ADA says we have to do it, we'll do it. And ACA is the Canadian version of ADA. It's essentially very much the same thing, but it's slightly different. And this is why I'm not a big fan of compliance. Compliance protects companies. Compliance is not flexible. There's a wrong or a right way to do it. Compliance often takes only one disability into account at a time. So when you look at that, the issue like ramps, they don't really take into account people with visual disabilities when talking about compliance for ramps. They take like minimum heights, and they talk about handrails, and they talk about all this other kind of stuff, but they don't think or talk about compliance for people that have other disabilities other than just mobility disabilities, or people that are other kinds of mobility disabilities, maybe other than like wheelchairs. So it's sometimes a very difficult thing to deal with somebody that's only very interested in compliance, because you might find yourself arguing over some things a lot because they want to only really like take one thing into consideration. I'm a big fan of like the inclusive approach, because inclusion thinks about intersections like mobility and vision, and it gives you the freedom to think about things like how vision and hearing accessibility features could benefit everyone. And going back to this, our favorite picture, this was very passionately argued by someone on Twitter that I was in a thread with to be compliant. And they sat there and they went, oh, well, judging by the rise of the step and the amount that it's sloped, it's probably this much of a slope, and so it doesn't need handrails according to this statute and Canadian accessibility law. I just sat there and went, okay, so like it's obviously still kind of needs handrails. There's steps, like it's a safety issue. Like I don't know that it matters that the code says that it doesn't need handrails. Like if people are using it and they say that it needs handrails, or if somebody looking at it says, yeah, definitely fall down that, then it's something that you need to consider. So the inclusive model really does take more of a step back and look at like, okay, maybe the concrete should be alternating colors so that people with visual disabilities can see it. Maybe there should be a light flashing or a sound or something so that people know that they're about to approach steps. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about like how to include people and including them in the conversation rather than just making assumptions about them or following a compliance handbook is really the way to go about service design, because we want to follow that person as they discover the service, interact with the service, and exit the service. And in this instance, the service isn't even usable. It's not even the right service. So I really want to encourage everybody to start thinking about like, how can we make services that support people with their needs for access. That's all of the planned comments that I have right now, and I have some book lists and resources and things. Book recommendations. Yes, I have an entire list. It has about probably 100 books on it. So I'm happy to share this whole slide deck with the Service Design Network group, and they're welcome to either email it out or make it available however they would like to. Max, you can chime in here and let me know how I can make this available to everyone.
Yes, we can share that with an email after the event for sure. Yes.
Yeah, I'm happy to share this. So that's all I've prepared, but I'd love to talk some more and let people ask questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was very interesting and a lot of good examples. And thank you for roasting our picture that we used. Now I see it very differently, and it makes a lot of sense. It is yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I when I saw the picture, it made me kind of laugh, but I figured it would be an amazing opportunity because a lot of people do think that this is a very accessible example. And I think when we had our planning meeting, whoever picked the picture, I won't name names, said that it was one of the first pictures that came up when they Googled accessibility. So it's obviously something that a lot of people think is accessible.
I picked the picture. I made a mistake. It was like really the first picture that came out when you start Googling, accessible design. So it's really interesting that it's not actually accessible.
Yeah, there was actually an entire article posted about this staircase, this one staircase, and how it's actually not accessible to people. But no, I think that it's a great talking point, which is why I was excited actually that you picked it, because it provided a great jumping off point for a lot of the things I wanted to talk about.
Okay, we have time for questions. I have two here that I can start with. Is there a hierarchy of accessibility? Like, should I make sure my text is legible and screen reader ready prior to making sure the content avoids offending readers? I guess legal liability versus reputation correction. So
sorry, you cut out at the very beginning of it. You
okay,
said, is there a hierarchy? Is that what you said?
Yeah, I'm going to copy paste in the chat as well.
Mm.
It will be easier with my accent.
So I would say that there's not really a hierarchy. It strays into that whole like legal compliance. Don't really love it because again, there's a lot of really murky area in legal compliance. Like they just released some guidelines in March, on March 18th of this year. And they finally said like websites are definitely 100% included in the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was like news that had not been explicitly stated before. So we have that coverage, but there's not any hard compliance. And the problem with that is that then people will use compliance as a way to say like, oh, well, I was compliant, so it doesn't matter if I excluded somebody because I was compliant. I followed the compliant guidance. So since I did that, like you can't make me change, which is a big problem because sometimes it's not so cut and dry of like, if you do XYZ, then you will be compliant. And I would say that there isn't like a disability that you should be compliant for before other things, especially as it depends on what you're working on. For instance, Clubhouse was a really big thing for a while, and they were primarily a voice chat application, but they didn't have any closed captioning support at all, not even automatic captions, which would be an improvement over nothing at all. They also didn't have good screen reader support. So folks that were trying to like navigate and understand what was going on via screen reader were just SOL. And that I was introduced to Clubhouse at a time where I was exclusively using a screen reader, and it was just a mess. It was a huge mess. There were some podcasting apps as well. That's what really tipped me, because I was just like, okay, podcasting app, that should be ideal for a person that has a visual disability because there is no visual content, right? But to get to the area where you'd be listening to the audio content, you had to get past some visual content to choose your genres and to choose your podcast that you wanted to select. And so there's like all these barriers in between me and my content that it was just like not ready for a screen reader. So I think it really does depend. If you make barriers and one of those areas where I feel like from my point of view, that was such a kind of like very low thought kind of exercise of saying, okay, well, I have audio content. I should make sure that it's accessible to people that would consume audio content. and could easily consume audio content. I feel like that one was like very low thought investment, but there's a that's not always apparent to everybody. So that's where that interpretation and research and everything comes in, of saying like, okay, well, I need to really figure out what are the important things that who am I blocking access to is the big question that guidance answered, that you cannot block access. If your product blocks access to somebody, then you're not in compliance. Then you're like actively discriminating against people. And so there's not like a one thing that you can say, well, I made it compatible with screen readers, so it's okay, because you could still be discriminating against somebody that has a cognitive disability. Or you could be discriminating against someone who is hard of hearing and not have closed captioning. So it's really not a hierarchy. It's just more like, it's like having good code, or good design. There's so many things that you have to cover, and if you do one of them wrong, then you could end up with a product that just isn't a minimum viable product. But if you do it right, then you could end up with something that is amazing and kind of world changing for a lot of people. I mean, for me, that's what some of the tech that we have now has been. It's been just like, it's changed my entire life.
Thank you, Soren. We have another question. I work in access services and I have a disability, new to design, but I think it's important to try to make designs as universally accessible as possible. You can continue to improve over time, but if you can already identify these things early on, why not address it now? Yeah, what is the barrier?
Yeah, I would say that the earliest you can address things is better. For one, because it's less expensive to retrofit, right? If you design something to be accessible, then it's less expensive to either design a new feature to make it accessible, or to redo the UI, or redo how things are laid out. It's definitely, it's less time, it's less investment, it's also less frustration. I feel like sometimes you end up throwing away work if you don't design things to be accessible in the beginning. And yeah, why not? Why not do it that way? It's just like saying, oh, well, we won't really consider making it responsive. Like, people don't use iPhones, right? Like, they'll just use desktops. And people won't use Android. So like, I know they're different sizes, but maybe we'll just design for iPads and desktops. Like, that's it. Just those two sizes. So it's really kind of almost silly to me now that I understand accessibility a little bit better, because things that make for good accessibility from a UI perspective and like plug into those operating system level good UI accessibility things, they're also just good code. A lot of times when I find problems with UI, it's also just like kind of hacky coding or just not great design, or just, there's never like one answer to a design. But I find that when people aren't addressing accessibility, it's because they have left a lot of people out of that part of the process, or they've just designed it and they're like, oh, well, this makes sense to me. There was a mentee that I had that was like, I don't know how to get through to this designer I work with, because they think that all headers are inactive, and so thus don't have to meet contrast requirements. And I was just like, I don't understand this way of thinking at all, because like, oh, it just made me like pull my hair out, because headers are not active in the way that like links can be active, but they are not like inactive in the way that you think of like a button that's inactive, or just, or some people call disabled. Button would be inactive. So it's very much like this interpretation thing is very, very hard. and not everybody is really up to the challenge, but it's really difficult to sometimes people will fight you on the smallest thing, like making headers contrast appropriately. But I showed it to somebody who was sighted and they were like, I totally missed that at first because the contrast was so light. I had missed that there were headers, and they did not even know what question I'd asked them. I was just like, hey, what do you think of these headers? They were like, oh, I missed those at first. And I was just like, it makes it better for everybody. Just have big contrast. I don't know why people want to fight over it. I'm reading this comment from Thomas right now. I heard, like Thomas says, I think I heard Leon Watson say something like, it's possible to meet all the WCAG success criteria and still have a product that's not usable. Content has meaning and purpose, so it should be highly visible. Yes, it's true. In fact, there was someone that coded the site. It was entirely accessible, but was also entirely unusable. And it tickles me to no end. It really does drive home the fact that testing is the last step of making something accessible, is making sure people can actually use it, because accessibility is just good usability. It's just inclusive usability.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's good. You should make a t-shirt out of this one.
I will do it. That's actually an original, so.
I wonder if there are like accessibility guidelines when it comes to like designing a service, because I think that if you think of designing a specific interaction, like reading a web page, or I don't know, doing something very specific on an interface, there are like guidelines that you can refer to if you don't have representation within your team. But also, like, I'm thinking, when like the example you were making before with the shopping application, that one is like a gap at kind of at a higher level, because they are providing that service through images, and so it's not the interaction, but like it's the way that they are choosing to provide that content that is not accessible. And so it's almost like if you're designing a service, there are like considerations that you have to take upfront in the concepting and like the phase that you won't be able to solve later with increasing contrast or doing some more tactical interventions. And I wonder if there are like any type of like guidelines that can help service designers to get at those before it's too late.
So I think that, there's somebody asked me once, like, oh, is there a checklist for, this really specific topic in regards to accessibility? And I was like, I think we're making those right now. Like, this is the time to be making those. Like, we are kind of on the cutting edge of those things. There's not a lot of information out there about, like even feature design and accessibility. Like, that's something that I am stunned that there's not a lot of workshops about, like how to do feature design at an accessibility level, or even like case studies. Like, almost every talk I have ever heard of or attended on accessibility has been like, I'm here to make you aware of accessibility. Here's a couple of things you can do. Put fields, form fields, you should put labels on them. You should talk to developers. Like, design should be taking more initiative and like doing more of the UI stuff. That's most of like all that I've heard about design is like taking the developer angle and pulling some of that back onto design, taking on some of that burden. So I think that we're in that moment right now. We're writing it. We're making the either the checklists or the processes right now, the frameworks. And as much as I would really love to be like, yes, there's an easy thing, here it is. I think we have to kind of like forge those for ourselves because they are so specialized to the products that we're making. Especially when we start to consider how many different kinds of disabilities there are. There's, you know, like the 5 sort of major categories, but like, how do we make sure that these things that we're creating address all of those 5 categories? Well, sometimes we have to kind of like start with one. Like people ask like, is there a hierarchy? Well, no, but there definitely are underserved populations. So if we think about like the rideshare example that I mentioned, people that have visual disabilities have an incredibly tough time getting rideshare because people will leave you at the curb if you have a service animal. People will leave you at the curb if you have a cane or you cannot find the car. I have been left many times in New York City because people won't wait for me to find them. They won't put their flashers on if I ask them. And it's one of those things where it's like, okay, well, that's like a very clear case of like something that we could do to change an entire industry just by changing driver education or changing how the app works, changing the accessibility settings in the app where, you know, it just changes the interaction between the rider and the app and the driver. It's just, it changes everything. I think that there's not like going to be this is exactly what you should do. I think we could probably set up some frameworks and things like that, but like I said at the beginning, we're writing those now.
Thank you, Soren. We have a few more minutes. I have a question here. What are some examples that consider multiple disabilities in its design? Do you have some stuff in your mind?
Yeah, well, going back to the rideshare example, one of the things that we considered was like the flashing light thing. Came up a bunch of times because a lot of people don't consider that people that have visual disabilities still have, they have a spectrum of sight. So it's not like either the lights are on or off. It's more like, okay, well, there's a couple of different like axes where you have like clarity, color, light, and motion. So there's a couple of different ways in which we form our entirety of visual perception. And so if you don't have clarity, for example, you may wear glasses. If you don't have as much like light information, that is definitely one that I deal with this eye. I don't get as much light information because I have some retinal detachments there, and that means I don't get information at all. But a lot of people, they do still get information of some sort, even though it's not what we consider sighted information. So a flashing light may really help them to locate the car. Maybe a specific color would help, like a branded color that goes with the brand so they know exactly what they're looking for. Maybe it's to help them find their particular car, very much like almost like a QR code, but in light. We also played around with sound, and that's where we really hit on the thing of a lot of people who are hard of hearing or deaf use flashing light, like the flashlight portion of a phone. They use that instead of sound for alarms and ringing and things like that. So if you're hard of hearing or deaf, then your phone just flashes at you, and that's how you know it's ringing. We ran into the same thing with the rideshare service, is that we started designing something for someone that had a visual disability, and they said, well, actually, I also am hard of hearing, and we're a hearing aid. And this actually would be very helpful for me because I would be able to see the light even though I can't see it clearly, and it would help direct me towards the way that I need to go, which I think is like a really, it was a really interesting moment where we didn't realize we were designing for 2 disabilities, but we ended up doing that. There's often a lot of synchronicity between visual and hearing disabilities, which I think is kind of, it's kind of interesting, seeing as sometimes the way to gain accessibility around this is often the opposite sort of thing. Like you have visual descriptions for videos for people that have visual disabilities, and you have captions, or essentially descriptions of what's happening in the audio for people that have you know, auditory disabilities like hearing loss. So that's really interesting to me, that sometimes the solution is sometimes the same thing.
Awesome. I love all those examples with the right chair. It's very cool. We almost had time. Anything else we wanted to ask, or where can we find you, Soren, if we want to continue learning from you? Yeah,
the best place for, excuse me, to find me is on Twitter or LinkedIn. On Twitter, I'm Soren FYI, and on LinkedIn, I'm UXicorn, and I actually do have another talk coming up. If you're interested in getting the UI level 101 kind of talk about accessibility, Maze is having a Global Accessibility Awareness Day celebration on Thursday, and there is a big event with other panelists, some of them a lot more accomplished than I am, and we'll be getting together and chatting about how to work accessibility into every stage of the design process. So it is a much more entry-level talk about you know, more that getting started. Do you have a link for that event, maybe? Yeah, I'm pulling it up right now. I put your LinkedIn on the chat if people wants to connect with you. Okay, I dropped it in the chat as well, the Maze event. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Soren. That was very interesting and very detailed. And I'm really, yeah, I have to work on a big revamp of the website now. So it's perfect for me to like start from scratch and have good accessibility from the beginning. So thank you for all the good reminders. Thank you so much for having me. It was really nice to spend this time with y'all.
Yeah, thank you very much. Max, can you cue some exit music or something?
Oh yeah, let's put some music again. I was too slow.
You can also stop recording.